Okay, hello. Okay, let me learn. Okay. Start. Okay. So what we're going to learn now is the first chelik of Sikha. The first chelik of a Sikha in it's Likud. It was published in Likud Sikha Zayin, and then in Chav Ches Sivan, Tavshin Nun Aleph, the Rebbe spoke a very strong Sikha, very famous. And the Rebbe spoke about Chassidim, they should do something to bring back. So at the time, they went to Likkutei Sichos, and they found the Sichos where the Rebbe speaks about in Yonim, about Mashiach, Yesodis, Shittis, about Geula, about Mashiach, and they published it as Likkutei Sichos ben Yoni Geula Mashiach. Then later, a week later, in Eretz Yisrael, in the Kfar Chabad, they used to have a section called Dvar Malchus, which was a Sikha, and there they published this in Lashon HaKodesh. When it came back to the Rebbe was very happy. It's 4 Sikhs, and the Rebbe wanted it published, and the Rebbe handed it out to every person. It was Tezvav Iyar. And that was 30 years ago. And therefore, from now till Gimel Tammuz, there's a big hisoidus in the world to learn these sikhas. And the first chelik of the sikha, it's largely an analysis of the beginning of the Rambam's halachas about Mashiach. In the end of his Sefer Hayad, the Mishnah Torah, the Sefer Rambam, so there's Hilchus Malachim u'Mulcham Yisayim u'Melech HaMashiach, and the last 2 prakim, Perek Yud Aleph and Yud Beis, are the halachas about Mashiach. It's the only halachas sefer, the earlier halachas svarim that we have about Mashiach. So the first chelik of the Sikha, the Rebbe analyzes and raises some questions. In other words, in the way of analyzing and understanding a text, you have to look at the text and you have to pay attention to the structure, to the nuances, because together you can understand what the author is trying to say. So we can read it a little bit like, Medrash, the chlolos, that we get it, and we don't necessarily get the nuances, or we can learn it properly like halacha sefer. So the beginning of the Sikha is the analysis and saying, look, if we just read it simply, we don't get it. There's something more here that the Rambam clearly is trying to define as part of the halachas about Mashiach and about the Geula. And in the conclusion of the Sikha, which Amir Tashem will learn next week, the Rebbe puts together the structure, a very big yisoid, of what the Hagdara, how do you define what's Mashiach according to halacha? What's the concept? And of course, this is very important because the chiyuv of lahamin and lachakus for bias HaMashiach has a halachic Hagdaras. It's defined by halacha. Like everything in Torah is defined by halacha. So understanding this is very critical. If you go to a website called tutaltz, tutaltz.com, I think it is. So they have a copy of the Sikha there. We'll do it inside. It's text, even though we're online, also it's a bit hard to listen online. It's in the Hebrew and in English. We'll try anyways. Kosev Rambam b'Seif Hilchas Malachim. The Rambam writes at the end of the Hilchas Malachim, in the first halacha of the Prakim that talk about Mashiach. So it's Perek Yud Aleph, and in the first halacha he writes this: V'chol mi she'enei mamin boi, someone who doesn't believe in a Mashiach, or alternatively, mi she'enei mechaka l'biyasi, he doesn't await for his coming. So then, lo b'sha'ad neviim b'lvadu kofer, is not only is there a kfira, a denial of the prophecies of the other prophets, ela b'teira v'meish Rabbeinu. It is also in the kfira in Teira Meish Rabbeinu. Why would that be classed as a kfira of Teira Moshe? Sharei HaTeira Ida Alav. The Teira testifies, declares that there's going to be a concept of Geula. The pasuk says, and here he brings the pasuk of Nitzavim, which is a separate discussion why he brings that pasuk. Shenemar v'shava Hashem alikecha shvuscha. Hashem will return those who were away and return them back to Eretz Yisrael. Kibbutz Goliath. So that's the pasuk of the concept of Mashiach, of the Geula. That's Bepashtus. And then, the Rambam then continues in that halacha, that not only is it in the pasuk in Parshas Nitzavim, the concept of Geula, but also Parshas Bilam, also in the parsha where Bilam speaks. Nemar, it talks about Mashiach. Visham, and here the Rambam adds something very interesting. Niba, Bilam prophesizes Bishni Amshichim about two Mashiachim. Mashiach Harishain, Shuhu David. The first Mashiach, which is David. Shehishias Yisrael Miatzareyam, that brought salvation to the Yidden from their hands of the oppressors. That is the first Mashiach. And the final Mashiach that will stand up, Mibonov, from the descendants of David, Shemishiach Yisrael Ba'achreina. So the Rambam, in telling us about Mashiach, immediately starts talking about two Mashiachim. One, David, that saves the Yidden from the hands of the oppressors back in the days of David, and also one of the final redemption. And the Rambam doesn't suffice for saying that, the two Mashiachim, but he articulates in detail. And then he says the pasuk, he explains the pasuk that there are four expressions that Bilam uses, or 8 expressions, and the Rambam says they are categorized into 4 groups, and each group, one expression talking about David and the other about Mashiach. Vishamu Eimer, Arena v'loy atam. When Bilam says, I see it, but it's not now, Zed David. And then Ashodenu v'loy kodev, again, which is a repeating expression, I see it, v'loy kodev, it's not close, Zed Melech HaMashiach, that refers to Melech HaMashiach. So it's different than the Rashi. And the Rambam says, so this, when he's repeating the phrase, I see it, but it won't happen now, the expression, one's talking about David and one about Melech HaMashiach. The same thing is with the second set, Dorach Kechav Miyakev, a star will arise from Yaakov. So he says that refers to Zed David, and then become Shevet Yisrael, a ruler will arise from amongst Yisrael, Zed Melech HaMashiach. And then it says, Umachatz Pas Moyav, he will smite the whole land of Moav, Zed David. And he brings a raya the pasuk from Shmuel v'yachas Moav v'yimadedim b'chevel. And then it says, Bilam says, v'karkar kol bnei Sheis, and also he will strike or wipe out all the children of Sheis. What exactly that means is a separate discussion. Zeh Melech HaMashiach. That he'll rule from sea to sea in the entire world. Again, so this is the third expression about how David or Mashiach rule over the world. And it says V'hoya, and then the pasuk says V'hoya Edom Yeresha, he will conquer Edom, Zed David. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, that he Edom the David Avodim. And then when Bilam says V'Yeresha Soyer Eivav, Zeh Malach HaMashiach Sheneval Mishim. So the Rambam takes these psukim of Bilam, the Nevi'as of Bilam, and he explains how it refers to the two Mashiachim. So somehow, right in the opening of the discussion of the Rambam, when he talks about Mashiach, he tells us that it's Loi b'sha'ara nevi'im bilvad. It's also Teiro Moshe Rabbeinu, and also he says that it's also in the Parshas Bilam, and Parshas Bilam talks about Shnei Mashiachim, Mashiach Rishon and Mashiach Achrein, and then he goes on at length and he explains in the Psukim how you see that there's one thing that spans across the two Mashiachim, David and Mashiach. So that is a summary of the first halach. So v'hinei Sefer Hayad hu Sefer Halachas. The Rambam wrote many svarim, but the Sefer Hayad is a Sefer Halachas. Kedibri Rambam Bagdamosei. The Rambam himself writes in his introduction to the Rambam, the Sefer, and he writes that it's a Sefer Halachas. And B'tzorech Lahavin, if that's what the Rambam is coming to say, and as the Rambam defines it in his Akdama, we have to understand what he's doing here. Kedei le'echiach es ha'halacha shekol mi she'einu memaimim beichulu kefa b'teiro of Moshe Rabbeinu. The Rambam just wants to simply declare and tell us that if you don't believe that you're as a kfir in Teiro Moshe Rabbeinu, haya masbik lo haya kesef rak af b'parshas Bilam nema b'sham nibe b'Mashiach. He could have said that the Parshas Bilam talks about Mashiach, Mashiach Yisrael. And he doesn't have to tell us about the details. We can read the pasuk inside. If he just gives us the reference to Parshas Bilam, we can open the Chumash and we know the Chumash, and we can see that the pasuk is talking clearly. Bilam says, the end of days. Why does the Rambam feel compelled to detail and articulate the taich of each of those words in the pasuk, and that it's meduber the shnei mashiachim, it's talking about the two mashiachim, and then then he has to tell us which words refer to the first Mashiach and which refer to the second. In other words, clearly the Rambam is telling us something more here. The question is, what does the Rambam want to tell us? Even if the Rambam for some reason wants to give us the precise and articulate the place where the pasuk says, he could have bring the beginning of the pasuk, the end of the pasuk. But he doesn't have to go to the visual type. So clearly the Rambam is emphasizing here that there's something over here, the way that Rambam is translating the pasuk, that is negei lahalacha. And what does it mean it's negei lahalacha? It helps us define what it means Mashiach in halacha and what is required to believe in. Okay, so that's the first part. Sorry. Okay. Let's analyze this a little further. Then the Rambam. Now let's look at the words of the proof from there of that he brings from Bilam. A little more in detail. Mizesh Rambam Moisev Saraya Afit Parshas Bilam Nemar. Afal Pishe Kvar Hevi Lifneza Rayel Etzem Inyan Sharei Tere Ida Olav Shenem Shava Shama Lekecha Shusha. The Rambam goes and he brings the pasuk in Parshas Nitzavim, and then he says after Parshas Bilam Nemar. Why does the Rambam feel that he has to say after Parshas Bilam Nemar? So in Mashma, if you read the halacha, it appears Shaksuv Parshas Bilam maybe Rambam beikir lo ikir rayal etzem yasam Mashiach. He's bringing those psukim from Parshas Balak, where Bilam speaks, not to prove that there's a concept of redemption, B'yasam Mashiach, Kulas Yisrael Ma'agolos. Elo sheniba b'shnei HaMashiachim. The Rambam's emphasis is on the fact that there are two Mashiachim. Mashiach Harishon Shel David, and Mashiach Ha'achrin Shel Medubanav. And it appears when you read the Rambam that this is the reason, because he wants to emphasize this concept that there's two Mashiachim, that's the reason why he has to go and explain the psukim. When you look at the psukim closely, as the Rambam explains, you see there are two Mashiachim. And he wants to explain how you see there are two Mashiachim. And the question is, why is that important here? I mean, you can suggest that in the parsha in Nitzavim, it says about Geula, it doesn't talk about a Mashiach. The Eibishter will return, so you can say we understand in the Bilam it talks about a Mashiach, a person will take the Yidden, will lead the Yidden, take them out of Golus. But that doesn't explain the emphasis of the Rambam seems to be that there's a Shnei Mashiachim, and that's what he's bringing the story of Bilam. Okay. Let's go to, I'll summarize Ois Gimel, and then we'll go to Ois Daled. So in Ois Gimel, the Rambam, the Rebbe suggests that perhaps the reason why the Rambam wants to emphasize there's Shnei Mashiachim, maybe it's not negei la halacha to know the Shnei Mashiachim. Maybe it's just to give us a chizuk. Because this whole concept of Mashiach, this is kind of a radical. There'll be a redeemer. It'll take us out of Golus. So we say, you know what? It's Shnei Mashiachim. There's a Mashiach who was before, now also. Or similar, I guess, to what we have. This is brought from the Kir Sefer. Similar to the story of the end of Makkas, where Rabbi Akiva says that there are two parts of the Nevuah, and I see one part was in the Skyim, so the other part will also be in the Skyim. So similarly here, we see that David was a Mashiach, so also then Mashiach HaAchner will also be fulfilled. But if you look at the words of the Rambam, it's hard to say that this is just chizuk words. It doesn't appear that he wants to tell us the Mashiach is a certainty. He brings that Parshas Nitzavim. Mishein Mamem boy, he's koifer in Teira Moshe Rabbeinu. Here he seems to be pushing the Shnei Mashiachim, and therefore he explains this double language 4 times to tell us about it's matching. There's a symmetry between David and Mashiach. So this is the emphasis over here, that some reason the Shnei Mashiachim becomes very relevant to the halacha. And it's a very interesting point, because when we talk about Mashiach generally, we don't emphasize this concept that has to be Shnei Mashiachim, that David is a Mashiach. And Imam Mashiach. Where's this concept of Mashiach Harishain, which is David? And the Rambam Barichas tells us right at the opening about this, and seems to be defining what Mashiach is. Okay. Behemshech lazeh case of Rambam. So now let's continue building again. Remember, this is the analysis, and we're not going to jump to the answer, because we have to fully understand the text of the Rambam first. So we go to the next halacha. Because in halacha Beis, after the Rambam brings in halacha Aleph, the concept that Mishein Mamin and Mishein Mechaka, that there's an union of Bias HaMashiach and Teira Moshe Rabbeinu. And then he brings the concept that there's Shnei Mashiachim. So then he says another thing in a separate halacha. What does he say? Av be'ari miklot to Omer. Also in the parsha of Ari Miklot in Shoiftim, the Torah says, Im Yarchav Hashem lekechas guvulcha, after Moshe Rabbeinu sets aside the Ari Miklot, he says, Im Yarchav Hashem lekechas guvulcha, v'yisafta l'cha oit sholosh sharim. That if the Eibusher broadens the borders of Eretz Yisrael, then you must add another 3 cities of Ari Miklot, referring to the lands of Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni that was promised to Abraham Avinu, but Klal Yisrael never received that yet. We only received the land of the 7 nations, Yeshivas Amim, not the land of the 10 nations that was promised to Abraham. And this is the pasuk says, "Im yarchav Hashem lekechas gulcha, then v'yasafta l'cha eight shalosh harim." Says the Rambam, "Umei olam lo hoya davar zeh." This, the yarchav Hashem lekechas gulcha, never happened. And then the Rambam says, "V'leitziva HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'toyu." It cannot be that the Eibusher gave us an instruction in Torah that was l'toyu for naught, for nothing. Certainly, there was a time. There's going to be a time when we're going to have to do this. And therefore, the Rambam says, in Ari Miklot, it's clear as part of the mitzvah of Ari Miklot that we have to somehow have Bias HaMashiach when we'll have Eretz Yisrael will be broadened to include also the Eretz Keni Knizi Kadmei. Mehina Yadua Shagam Chalukes HaHalacha Shabarambam Hibudiyot. The Rambam himself split the halachas. If you look at the Kisvei Yad, he made, I think, 3 dots between each halacha, like a segel, I think, upside down segel. But tzarech lahavin. So what the Rambam was a very big daiken. You see the Rambam in his whole book, in his whole structure. So he gives us lechatchila in the beginning of the Sefer. He gives us how he structured all the svarim, and he gives us the halachas in each svarim. And he gives us the mitzvahs in each sefer. And then in the beginning of each sefer, he goes again, and he tells us here the halachas, here the mitzvahs. And then in the beginning of each page, each set, he tells us the particular mitzvahs that are relevant there. And the prakim are structured, and the halachas are structured. V'tzarech lahavim, lama maybe a Rambam raya zu b'halacha b'fnei atzma v'loi b'halacha shalifnei. If the Rambam just wants to emphasize that it says more places in the Torah, also not in Miklot. So why does he choose to bring it at a separate halacha? He does not bring it b'yachad im shtei harayis ha'achedesh u'menateda. Why doesn't he bring it together with the 2 rayos that he brought earlier? Clearly and obviously, the Rambam is not concerned just at the length of the halacha. The Rambam is splitting it because there's something meaning behind it. And so if he feels each raya should be in a separate halacha, the imatim shel kol raya ti'iksuv halacha v'nei atzma, havalei lichta gavarayim mepashas bin b'halacha v'nei atzma. If the Rambam feels that every halacha warrants its own, each raya warrants its own halacha, so Parshas Bilam should also be in the previous raya of Parshas Bilam should also be in a separate halacha. So in other words, if we translate this a little different, so the way the Rambam structured his halachas, it's clear that in halacha aleph, where he brings the raya from Parshas Nitzavim, and then he brings a raya from Parshas Bilam, Parshas Balak, he's trying to make one point, and then in another halacha by bringing Ari Miklot, he's not just repeating himself and saying another pasuk. Clearly, he's making another point. And the question is, what's the point that he's trying to make in halachic terms? Gam also, lama medayik litzayim mikera kosa befra b'loshen av be'ori miklu to omer. The Rambam gives us the Maramakim, but it doesn't say, like he said before, with Pashas Bilam. He tells us the topic of discussion, the Ari Mikla. So previously he said After Pashas Bilam, which seems to tell us a location. Here he should have said After Pashas Shoiftim. Why doesn't he call it Pashas Shoiftim? So clearly the Rambam is saying After Ari Miklot, he's trying to tell us something that is related to the content of what is being said. Ari Miklot. So what's that about? Okay. I say. Now let's look a little closer. So in other words, let's just summarize. The Rambam starts off that we have to, part of belief in Torah, Torah's Moshe, Torah Moshe Rabbeinu, the prophecy of Moshe is that there's a concept of Geula, there's the concept of Yisa Mashiach. He also makes a great length that this is somehow related to Shnei Mashiachim. And then he tells us that this is also related in the mitzvah of Ari Mikla. Let's understand a little more about the Shnei Mashiachim. Let's just analyze it a little more. Gam tzorich lahav diak haloshem b'shnei Mashiachim. Mazer negea lakan uvamed davke rak David nikra Mashiach. You're saying that it has to be two Mashiachim. Okay. Why don't you say two Goyalim? I don't know. And also, why is David called Mashiach here? I mean, Shaharei, Keshem David Nimshach V'Shem Mishcha V'Keren. Yeah, David was anointed with the Shemana Mishcha, and he's called Mashiach Hashem. K'meiken Lifneza Nimshach Sho B'Pach. Yeah, the Gemara says the different ones. V'Keren B'Pach. V'Gam Hu Nikra Mashiach Hashem. Sho was called Mashiach Hashem. So the question then is, if you have to choose Shnei Mashiachim, why are you choosing David and not Shaul? And Ima Kavani he Livcher Shnei Mashiach Yisrael. If perhaps the Rambam wants to choose David because he was more a Mashiach of the Yidden. So maybe we pick Moshe. David didn't take the Yidden out of Golus. Maybe choose Moshe. Okay. Well, if you talk about the prophecy of Mashiach, the Rambam does relate him to Moshe Rabbeinu. When he was as great as Moshe, or Kollel Moshe, not David. So in other words, the Shnei Mashiachim is somehow related to David. And it seems to help us understand and define the function of Mashiach according to Halacha. And it's important to know here that David was called Mashiach. Okay. Okay. In order to understand this, the Rebbe is going to analyze also the further halachas. So in Ois Vav, he's going to start understanding halacha Gimel, and then also halacha Daled. So if you understand, we build it slowly. We build the Rambam, what he says in halacha Aleph, and then halacha Beis, and halacha Gimel, halacha Daled. So then we start getting a picture of what this Mashiach is all about. Okay. So what's the Rambam write in Halacha Gimel? So second line of Izvav. Val yala al daitra. Sha'amelech HaMashiach tzarich lasis oisos u'moivsim. One should not have even a thought. It should not even enter one's mind that Mashiach has to do any miracles, or mechadish dvarim be'elam, or he has to make something new in the world, or mechaya mesim, resurrect the dead, or kayetze b'dvarim elu. Ein hadavar kach. The Rambam says that Mashiach halachically is not required to make any form of miracle, not even tchiyas hamesim. Sharei Rabbi Akiva cholu, and he brings a proof that Rabbi Akiva believed that Ben Kaziva was the Mashiach, and Rabbi Akiva was the greatest of the great. All the Teda that we have is Tedas of Rabbi Akiva. It's related to Lag BaOmer, the 5 students, the Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, etc. There were Talmidei of Rabbi Akiva, and yet we have the rule of Stam Mishnah is the Meir, etc. V'kula aliba de Rabbi Akiva. Everything's a Teda of Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva held the Kalim of Ben Koziva, says the Rambam. He never asked Ben Kaziba to do a miracle. So clearly, halachically, it's not required to have miracles done by Mashiach. Says the Rambam, Be'ikar advarim kochei. And then he finishes, after saying that you don't have to have any miracles, he says, Ve'ikar advarim kochei. The main things are the things like this. Sha'ateda hazois chukeha u'mishpoteha le'elam u'omi elamim. Now this Torah, its laws are forever. Ve'ein meisifin aleihem v'lo ygoydem, and you can't add and you can't detract. It's now, if you look at the Rambam, it's not clear what the buildup here is. It says that if you don't even think Mashiach has to make miracles, because Rabbi Akiva clearly didn't think so, and the Chacham didn't think so. And then he says, V'ikar advarim, that Torah is not going to be changed. It seems to be suggesting that if you somehow think that Mashiach has to make any miracles, you're suggesting that the Torah has to be changed. You're suggesting there's a Safa, a Giroin, and Torah. Like, what's the connection? And he says very strong language. Whoever adds or detracts or explains Torah incorrectly, and he changes the meaning of mitzvahs, not to mean simply as it says, he's a faker, a charlatan, he's not true. V'rasha, he's a rasha of epikoides. Now, and that seems to be saying in continuation to any suggestion that Mashiach has to make a miracle. The fact that the Rambam concludes with these words, it seems to apply the structure of what the Rambam is saying. If one suggests the Mashiach has to make a miracle, he's adding or detracting from the Torah. What's the connection? Why would be saying that Mashiach has to make a miracle, or saying that Mashiach has to do Tchias HaMesim? Why would that be a giroyin, a chisara, and adding or taking something to Torah? Okay. So the Rebbe adds another thing. When it comes to Nevi'us, prophecies, there's also a concept of a Navi making a miracle. And the Rambam says that he doesn't have to make a miracle like Moshe Rabbeinu did, or a miracle with Yoel, Elisha, or Mechayim Mesim, and so on. He says, the Rambam says that it's enough to predict what will happen, and it happens. That's also a raya that he's a Navi. There, the Rambam doesn't say that if you say the Navi has to do a Shini Minagish Alaylam, you're suggesting there's any Shini Geroyin in Torah. But here, in regards to Mashiach, it seems to be saying that if you suggest that Mashiach has to make miracles, you're suggesting a Shini and Geroyin B'Torah. So clearly, the Rambam in Halacha Gimel is very strongly defining that making miracles is not part of what Mashiach is halachically. To the extent that if someone suggests that it is so, then it's a giroyin in Torah, chisar in Torah, a shinu in Torah, a kvira in Torah, and so on. Okay. So again, we're slowly building. We have in Halacha Aleph the concept that is a part of Torah. We have in Halacha Aleph the concept that is Shnei Mashiachim. There's David and there's Mashiach, and then we have in Halacha Beis, you have the concept somehow Af Be'ari Miklot, and in Halacha Gimel we have this concept that that Mashiach is not defined by miracles. Hopefully, we'll put this together. We'll get a clearer definition of what Mashiach is and Gula is according to Halacha. Okay, then the fourth Halacha, Halacha Shalei Achriza. Now, after the Rambam tells us about the belief in Mashiach, he tells us what he's supposed to do. The Rambam continues. If a king arises from the house of David, a king of the house of David that arises. And he's Hege Batera. He learns Torah the whole time. V'oisik b'mitzvos. Kedavid Aviv. And this should be Kifi Torah Shebechsav Shabal Peh, according to the Torah Shebechsav and Shabal Peh. In addition to that, V'Yaakov Kol Yisrael. He gets all the Yidden. Leilich Ba. To follow the ways of Torah. And then Ulechazek Bitka. He reinforces, he strengthens the breaches of Torah. V'Yilachim Milchamis Hashem. And he fights the wars of the Eibishter to strengthen what the Eibishter wants. Hareza b'cheskashu Mashiach. The Rambam says he's considered chazaka, assumed in halacha that he's Mashiach. Then in Asav Yitzliach, and the Rambam says v'nitzeach kol ha'umas shebasiyuv, he actually is victorious over the nations around him, and upon a mikdash b'mkoimoi, and he builds a base of mikdash in its place. V'kibutz in Yisrael, and then he's followed by Kibbutz Golias, all the Yidden come back to Yisrael. Hareza b'Mashiach b'vadai. And be attacking the So'ilim, he'll rectify the entire world. Now, what's strange is the Rambam is saying that if a king does this, he's considered Mashiach. V'tzarech lahavim. Lo ma'eina Rambam maskikan. Gam lo b'chol ha'perek es ha'maylas ha'gdeilus b'emetaris malamech shriach. The Rambam here doesn't describe Mashiach in any great terms. And the Rambam himself writes earlier, they'll you wise in Shloima, the Navi Gadol Karv L'Moshe Rabbeinu. So why in the criteria here in the halachas about Mashiach does the Rambam omit these criteria? That Mashiach shulachayra be about Chachmi Yisem Navi Gadol Karv L'Moshe. Here's the halachas. So where's this definition of what Mashiach is? So again, this is we have to look a little bit about the belief in Mashiach, the Shnei Mashiachim. It's part somehow of our Mikla that's critical here. We also have to understand that Mashiach is not required to make miracles. And by suggesting Mashiach has to make miracles, we're actually being moisif or goyden in Torah. And then also seems that Mashiach's resume does not have to include that he's a wise, he's a great prophet, even though the Rambam described him previously that he'll be that, but it seems to be there's not a requirement in the halacha of what Mashiach is. So therefore, when we come here to the Rambam, and we're talking about the Hilchas Malachim, about halachas of who Mashiach is, this is not a requirement. So all this together seems to indicate there's something much more or different to what Mashiach is, and according to halacha. It's not just that he's going to be a fancy, spiritual guy is going to come down from heaven and start being Mechayim Mason, and things are going to start growing on the tree, and all miraculous things are going to start happening. This seems to be something completely different in a halachic terminology, al pi nigla, that we have to understand what Mashiach is. And this is a very relevant thing, because the Yud Gimel Ikrim of Ani Mamin B'Emunah Shlema B'Vias HaMashiach, and as the Rambam says, Misha Eina Mechakel B'Yosei, Misha Eina Mamin Boy, or Misha Eina Mechakel B'Yosei, has a definition of a Kefer B'Torah. We have to know what that means. What is the definition of a Kefer B'Torah? What's the Kfir in Torah? And what is that Hagdara? How do we find that? Okay. This is where we start introducing. We'll just go a little further, which then the Rebbe lays the foundation for what will come later on in the explanation. Till now, we just looked at the things that says there's something more here, and now we're going to start presenting that. Ois ches. V'yesh leimer habir b'chol zeh. We can understand all of this and understand what the Rambam is getting at by Hakdim. First, understanding Mashar Rambam Siddur Silchas Malachim B'siyum V'seif Sifrei Yad. The Rambam talks this and puts it in the halachas of Mashiach at the end of the Sefer, all the halachas. The L'chiyora, Lefi Seder Hazmanim. If we look at the chronology, K'mishakasav Rambam B'tchilas Silchas Malachim, as he writes in the beginning of the halachas and malachim of kings, the Rambam writes the following from the Gemara: Shalish mitzvahs nitzava Yisrael b'shas k'nisas la'aretz. There are three mitzvahs that the Yidden were commanded when they come to Eretz Yisrael. One is limis lem melech, to appoint a king, and lahachris zari shel Amalek, and to wipe out the children of Amalek. Believe in his beis abchira, to build a beis hamikdash. So if you feel, if these are the three mitzvahs, it should have come much earlier in the Sefer. There's a Hilchas Beis Abchira, much earlier on in Sefer Avodah. Halach is about building the Beis Hamikdash. If the order is first the Melech, then wiping out Amalek, then Beis Abchira, so this Limnes Lehem Melech, this Hilchas Melachim about a Melech, where Melech HaMashiach, Mashiach is essentially a Melech in Halacha here, should have come much earlier. Why did the Rambam put it at the end? And in the footnote, he goes into the Radvaz's alumnus in the Radvaz, and the Radvaz wants to suggest that the reason why it comes at the end, because the dinim is only, as they say, Hilchas of the Mashiach, Allah of the Mashiach comes. So anything that's practical nowadays, the Rambam brings earlier, but if it's only Hilchas of the Mashiach, he brings it later on. The difficulty with that is because then all the Karbanis is also fit into the same category. And the Rebbe says maybe you can answer that it's related to Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin comes later because the Sanhedrin have to be part of this process, and the Sanhedrin come at the end. So first he talks about the Yidden and then eventually Sanhedrin, but it seems to be something that needs a little more explanation. Okay. So v'yesh leimar. But Mesha Rambam Siddur Seb B'siyum Sifrei Hayad, the fact that the Rambam puts it at the end of a Sefer Halachos, Harehu Madgish, what he's emphasizing is Shashleimus Kiyum HaTeira V'Halacha Nasa B'Shash Yeshina Malachim. He's trying to tell us that the end and the completeness, where's Teira fully niskayim, fulfilled and completed, and in a wholesome way, is when you have the Ina Malachim. Okivish is a moving gamba pashtus. Everyone understands this. When can you fulfill Teira mitzvahs properly? When you have a Melech Yisrael, Shayodei Miskayemes mitzvahs Mechemes Hashem. You can have properly. You can wipe out Zari Shalom Malik. You can't do without a king. And you have the mitzvah building Beis Hamikdash, and only when you have a Beis Hamikdash and you have Krisis Zari Shalom Malik, you wipe out a Malik. You can have Kim Teira Kol mitzvahs. Like many mitzvahs, you can't keep without a Beis Hamikdash. Okay. So in other words, the Rambam is telling us over here that there's Torah mitzvahs, halachas. The Rambam, the only sefer that has all the mitzvahs. Where do we? And we know this. And how can we be mekayim all Torah mitzvahs? Is going to be dafke when you have a melech. Which melech allowed this to happen and made this happen? Who eventually conquered all of Eretz Yisrael and finished the Melchama and started the preparation of the Beis Hamikdash was David. In other words, what happens when we look at a Mashiach from the perspective of someone who brings about full fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs, that's the first melech to do that is David HaMelech. And this is where we see the Shnei Mashiachim. So we start building the concept of Mashiach is Shleimus Teda Mitzvahs. Fulfillment of Teda, that one fulfills Torah and fulfills mitzvahs in its complete way. And to do that, you need a melech. And we'll see later on that this is how Mashiach is defined in halacha. Mashiach's definition in halacha is the skiyum Torah mitzvahs v'shleimus. And this is B'shnei HaMashiachim, we'll see later, is and the Mishnei HaMashiachim is the first Mashiach, which is David HaMelech, which brings that about earlier on. And then we have a later Mashiach that brings it about in the B'kar of Mamish. Okay, so this is the first part of the Sikha. And Mitzvah Hashem, next week, we'll continue to analyze this and explain what the Agdara Mashiach is in Halacha. Okay, very good.